okay? So if you got a Bible, I want you to turn to Nehemiah, and I want to ask you a question today. What distracts you in your life? What are some distractions that come up in your life? A distraction is a thing that prevents someone from giving their full attention to something else. Distraction is something that prevents somebody from giving their full attention to somebody else. Commonly in 2018 and 2019 and 20 and on beyond, a lot of times when we think of the word distracted, it goes with the word driving, doesn't it? Distracted driving is a big deal. Did you know that 16 people are killed every day in the United States because of distracted driving? Now, I'm not sure how they all figure that out, but there are a lot of people who are on the road that are distracted, aren't there? You can tell, can't you? Because they're looking down, or they're doing this while they're driving, or they're doing this, and putting on their makeup. Some of you are putting on your makeup, and doing that. Or maybe you can tell when somebody is driving down the road and something falls onto the floorboard, and you're seeing them kind of reach over. And have you ever done this? Have you ever just reached over as far as you could, hoping that you could get that ice cream sandwich off the floor and eat it on the way? I mean, you don't want to sit there and let it melt on the road, and so you reach over, and all of a sudden, you're in the other lane or doing something. Distractions can be very harmful, can't they? And they can be devastating. If you drive the turnpike between here and Tulsa very much, like we do, oh my goodness, you just see things, you just go, I can't believe what I just saw, especially in construction zones where they've narrowed everything down and there are no shoulders or anything, and you're next to trucks and all of that stuff, and you'll see somebody that's not paying attention to the road, and you think, man, something's going to happen. And guess what? Something does happen a lot on that road because people are distracted. It can be really devastating for sure. Distractions can cause death and devastation. I think back to a story that I remembered in my mind, and then I went back and I researched a little bit this week about a plane trip that started at JFK in July or on December 29th, 1972. It was a Lockheed 1011 wide-body jet that left JFK and took off for Miami, Florida. I suppose everybody on that plane were thinking this is going to be a holiday trip and it's going to be a great time and everything. And everything was perfect about the trip until they started to go into their landing mode. And when they went into their landing mode, they put down the wheels, and apparently a bulb showed that the front wheel of the plane was not down. And that caused distress and distraction. And so they fiddled with things and they tried some stuff, and they told the air traffic controllers that they needed to go back up a little bit and swing back around and do all of that. There were 4 guys in the front of the plane at that time, and 3 of them ended up paying attention to the landing gear, and 1 guy was flying the plane. 1 guy went down into the avionics bay underneath the plane to look and to see if it was just a bulb issue or if the wheel really had gone down. And he was piddling around with that. All along, they had decided to put the plane into autopilot and just let it drift a little bit so they could figure out what was going on. And guess what happened? Somehow it got knocked out of autopilot. And the descent of the plane was so slight and so gradual that nobody on the plane realized that the plane was descending until they were about 1,000 feet above the ground, and it was too late. Going some 277 miles an hour, this plane plowed into the Florida Everglades. It was at a banking system. It was banking at the time, and when it banked, the left wing clipped the Everglades and flipped the plane over, and it drove it right straight into the ground. All because not a landing gear being not down, but because a bulb was out. And they found out later that it was the bulb, that the landing gear actually was down. And 101 people lost their lives that day. 101 people. 73 people were injured. 8 out of the 10 crew members were injured seriously. The other 2 were killed. And you think about how devastating distractions can be, and how they can really knock you off of track. And amazingly, really the last time we really see Nehemiah in serious action with all of his people trying to build the wall comes in Nehemiah chapter 6. And if you got your Bibles, you might want to follow along. We're just going to kind of walk through this today. Nehemiah had been called by God to go and rebuild this wall in Jerusalem. He had been given a burden which led to a vision, which led to a plan. And what was amazing about that is that it all came together at just the right time. And he was even able to go to the king and say, listen, I've got this plan. And he laid out the plan to the king, and the king said, why not? Why not go and do that? That sounds great. I was talking to somebody who goes to church here who has a job that demands a lot. They're gone a lot, and they wanted to go on a trip next year. And so they decided that they were going to ask their bosses for time off, and it came at a real strategic time in the year of this business that they're a part of. And so she asked her immediate boss, who said, you're going to have to go to the president of the company to get permission. And she was so scared and prayed and prayed and prayed about this because she thought for sure he was going to say, no, that isn't going to happen. And she went to the president of the company and she explained the entire thing to him. And he sat back for a minute and he said, well, if it is that important to you and if somebody wants to make it happen for you, you ought to go. And of course, she about fell over in her chair. But I told her, when she told me the story, I said, that sounds so much like Nehemiah, doesn't it? I mean, Nehemiah gets this burden, and then he gets this vision, and then he's got a plan, and he takes months to pray over it, and he struggles with it and everything, and all of a sudden the king in Nehemiah 1 says, you know what, you look really sad, and I've never seen you this way before. What is bothering you? And Nehemiah said, well, here's my chance. And you remember in Nehemiah, we've talked about this before, it says there right in Nehemiah 1, so I prayed to God. You ever had one of those just shotgun prayers where you just prayed to God and say, okay, God, we're on right now. This is it. This is what it's all about. There's one shot here. And he only had one shot with the king. And of course, he laid it all out to the king. And the king found favor with him and made it possible for him to go to Jerusalem and to start rebuilding the wall. And of course, once he got to Jerusalem and he started rebuilding the wall, the thing that he encountered, which is the thing we all encounter in our life, are critics. Are people that are going to complain and people that are going to try to stop us, because what is good for God is not good for Satan. Can I get an amen for that? I mean, whenever you are moving forward for God, you can be sure that Satan is going to oppose you at every step of the way. And it really doesn't matter what you're talking about. If you're talking about a wall, if you're talking about church life, if you're talking about business, if you're talking about being a better husband at home than you've ever been before, and you want to put everything that you've got into that, being a better husband, you can be sure that Satan's going to oppose that. That is not good for your family in his eyes. And the flip-flop is true too. It could be that you maybe want to be a better parent, or you want to be a better wife, or whatever it is. So this is going on in the book of Nehemiah all along. And we have Nehemiah here building a wall, but not only building a wall, but building a people. Okay, and this was a lot more about the people than it was about brick and mortar. He was building these people up. They were so discouraged and so beaten down. And now they could see that they could pull themselves together and they could do something for God. And with God's help, they could accomplish something. And so he continues to do this all the way to the end. Nehemiah 6 verse 1 says that when word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors in the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. On the plain of Ono. Now what this was an invitation to a distraction. Okay? They were ready to finish the wall. They were running toward the finish line. But all of a sudden, his enemies come up and say, hey, why don't you take a break and why don't you come off the wall and why don't we meet at Ono? Now, if you do a little historical study and a little bit of geographical study, you would know that Ono was an oasis that was on the Mediterranean coast. And Jerusalem is not the garden spot of the world, that's for sure. It's dusty and dry and brown and all kinds of, things that aren't really attractive to people. But you get toward the Mediterranean, you get a lot of green, better climate. And here these guys who are the enemies of God are saying, you know what, you have done so good here. Why don't we get together and talk? In really what they were saying was, let's have a peace summit. Let's get together and talk about how we can make peace since you've got the wall almost built. Let's try to do something here where we can work together. And in chapter 6, verse 2, it says there that they say, come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. But they were scheming to harm me. They were scheming to harm me. So I sent messengers to them with this reply: I am carrying on a great project or a great work, and I cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? What was Nehemiah doing? He was saying, we are going to finish the work. We are not going to be distracted. There's no need for a peace summit. There's no need for us to get out of dry and dusty and dirty Jerusalem right now and go down to the plain of Ono and relax and take it easy. I'm not going to get distracted like that, and I'm not going to take you up on your invitation. And you think, wow, that's pretty strong, isn't it? His was an emphatic no. It was an emphatic no. He did not check with his advisors. He didn't check with family members. He didn't check with other workers at all. He didn't need to because he recognized the threat, which was the threat of distraction. And that's why he could say in Nehemiah 3, I am engaged in a great work. I love that. Steve loves that word. We've been talking about this for 3 months now, about I am engaged in a great work. I cannot come down. Wouldn't it be great if you were engaged in great works and you decided, even when you were distracted or invited to take a detour in some way, that you could look at the enemy or look at your enemies or look at those who are trying to distract you and say, listen, I am engaged in a great work. I cannot come down. Now here's the problem. The problem is most of us don't think that our lives have anything to do with great works. We really don't. We settle for the mundane. We settle for the mediocre. We settle for getting through today and maybe tomorrow and maybe the next week. Right now, some of you are settling for just getting through the last 2 weeks of summer, and then you can get those kids back in school and all of that stuff. And you don't think of your life as something that God sees as a great work. A great work. And it might surprise you that even Nehemiah would say this after several weeks of working with these people around this wall and seeing all the critics and everything going on, that even he would feel like that it is a great work. But God calls every single one of us, every one of us, to great works, to great works. And one of the reasons that often we don't see the finish line in those great works is because we don't know that we're doing great works. And you say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, in 3 weeks, many of you, or 2 weeks, many of you are teachers, you're going to go back to the classroom. And I don't think many people say it as often as they should. I don't think we say it as often as we should. But if you're a teacher, you're doing a great work. You are doing a great work. God has chosen kids for you to influence them 6 or 7 hours a day for 9 months out of a year. And every second and every moment that you pour into those children, I want you to know you are doing a great work. And when you start that class and you walk into that class the first day of school here in a couple weeks, I want you to know you have moved from whatever your summer has been, you've moved from that now into greatness. If you're a teacher, you are doing great things for families. And I know because my wife's been an educator and has done a lot of work with small kids. It's not just the kids. It's the stories. It's the stories of moms and dads whose lives are a mess. It's the stories of abuse. It's the stories of distraction. It's the stories of people just not paying attention to their kids. It's the stories of people seeing the value of those kids but not giving them the chance to move forward. And you know, there's lots of times when Pam would come home from school and she'd tell me stories, not use names, but tell me stories. And I'd say, you know, it just makes me sick. Because you got to wonder if that kid has a chance or not. I want to say something to you teachers today. Those of you who are involved in the school system. You may be the best chance that kid ever has to move forward in their life. You may be the best chance. Just because of their circumstances. So don't get distracted. Don't say, well, I'm not doing anything that important. Don't listen to all the news and all the other stuff about pay and all that stuff. I know all of that is important, but let me just say this to you. You are doing a great work. If you're homeschooling your kids, you are doing a great work. If you're a preschool teacher, you're doing a great work because you're pouring into the lives of these children. You're doing something that's significant. You're doing a great work. And like I said earlier, so much of the time, we don't see ourselves as doing great things for God. God's called you to do that. If you're a business leader and you have employees that work for you and you have influence with those employees and maybe with other business contacts and so forth, you are doing a great work. You're doing a great work. You have influence. You have strength. Don't get distracted from those kinds of things at all. If you're a teenager or a young adult, you may think there is nothing great about my life. There's nothing great. I'm just trying to cruise through to get a certificate at the end that says that I'm going to graduate, and then everybody will be happy and off my back and I can go do whatever I want to do. But I want you to know something. You have influence that I will never have in the lives of the kids that you go to school with. Whether it's through sports or through activities or scouts or whatever it is that you're doing, you have an opportunity to do great things. And some of you are on the verge of your senior year of high school, and you're thinking, all I got to do is just got to get through this. Just got to get through the first semester, then get through the second semester, and it gets mundane, and it gets boring, and it gets dull for you and those kinds of things. I just want you to know, make it something different. It's a great work that you're doing, that God's called you to do, and that you can make it the best year of your life. I think about some of you that take care of your family members, maybe because of health issues or other issues, and you think, well, there's nothing really special going on there. No, there's big-time special stuff going on there. You're doing a great work. You're doing a great work when you watch out after your mom. You're doing a great work when you watch out after your dad. For years and years and years, I used to call my mom and dad birthdays, holidays, and stuff like that. And I kind of started hearing from them a little bit more about, you don't call very often. And I thought, well, okay, I'll call you more. And so I call once a month. And I fly out there a couple times a year and see them and everything. It's amazing how my perspective's changed as they've gotten older. They're 84 and 80 now. They're sick. They're on the verge, Dad's on the verge of diving deep into dementia land, and I see that. My mom's sick and basically an invalid. And you know what? I started about 2 years ago calling them every week. And man, every time I called them, they would say, thank you so much for calling us. Thank you so much. We love these phone calls. And then I started hearing things from them like, you're not calling very often. I'm thinking, I'm calling every week. So you know what I do now? Pretty much I call twice a week because it's important to them. And I've decided that maybe some of the greatest things that I do at my age right now have to do with two people living in Oregon who have done great things for me in my life. And I don't need to be distracted from that. That's a calling that God's put on my life right now. If you're a parent or a grandparent, you're doing some of the greatest work that's out there. And I want to encourage you that the children that you have, now listen to me for this. I say this all the time, and write it to new parents or write cards to people who have babies, but I want to say it from the stage today. The child that you have was chosen for you. And you were chosen for that child. And so some of the greatest work you'll ever do in your life is being a mom or a dad or a grandma or a grandpa. You see, when we read all of this and we see Nehemiah and we see him saying, I am doing a great work, we can blow right by that and not even think about that. But you're doing great work too. So is this church. This church is doing some great work. And we have the stories that unfold before our very eyes of people that have been touched and lives that have been changed. And this week I talked about Larry in my Facebook because Larry, it just struck me Monday night when Larry was here for VBS, Larry Rhodes. You know, a year ago, Larry was lost. He was just gone. He didn't know Jesus, and he was lost, and his family invited him to come to church. And so he started coming, and he started feeling pretty good about things. And then I started hearing from Larry every once in a while. He said, it just feels like family there. It just feels like family. We got to talking about his life and his relationship with Christ. And last February or March, I baptized him, and he thought that was so. He said, I don't know why I waited so long to do this, And if you know Larry, he's got a bald head and everything. He shaved his head just for his baptism, which I thought was really cool. I mean, he was such an important part of what was happening in his life. And then come this July, there is Larry on the first night up in the stage with a bunch of kids. Larry is 70 years old. And you know what? Larry is doing a great work. And he is not coming down. And even when he's been attacked and been bumped around a little bit, he still stays with it, loving Jesus and loving this church. And he tells me all the time, I love this church because it feels like family. It just feels like family. And I don't know what's all wrapped up in that word family for him, but there are times I want to just sit down and tell me about your life, because he just thinks this is his family. He's not here today because he fell during the week and bumped his head and had some issues, and so he's kind of homebound for a little bit until he gets better. But I want you to know something. Larry is doing a great work. And when I'm 70 years old, I want to be doing a great work. And when I'm 94 or 93 years old, like Ira is, Ira, you're doing great work. You, Marguerite, you guys are doing a great work. Your encouragement and your love and your faithfulness is showing people how to do the great work. You have not come down. And I think, man, how amazing is that to have people who are doing great work? We all are. So I want to challenge you to not get distracted by the invitations that look good, but to stay up on the mountain, stay up on the wall, and do the great work. It would have been really easy for Nehemiah to say, yes, I need a break, and I need relaxation, I need to get out of this heat and everything else. But Nehemiah said no to oh no. Did you get that? He said no to oh no. He would not go down off that wall. Now here's the second thing that happens in this chapter, and it's crafty, it's tricky. In verse 5 it says, the fifth time, this had happened 4 times now that they had offered to meet at Ono, and each time he gave them the same answer in verse 4. And then it says, the 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter which was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it's true. Now, I want you to stop right there. If you're reading this, it says it is reported among the nations. In other words, I have heard. Now, I got to tell you, when somebody says to me, I have heard, my radar always goes up. What have you heard? Or if somebody says, everybody is talking about this, would you explain to me who everybody is? Who is everybody? And he goes, well, it's just everybody. Well, okay. But then he adds a little bit to it, and Geshem says it's true. Now, what's interesting about that is Geshem is one of the bad guys. And so this doesn't add weight to this at all. As a matter of fact, I'm sure Nehemiah thought, well, if Geshem says it's true, it probably isn't. He says, it's reported among the nations, and Geshem says it's true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building a wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now report this. This report will get back to the king, so come, let us meet together. So instead of doing an invitation now, he's going to use innuendo to try to distract him and to knock him off the wall. And boy, that happens all the time. I think about when people talk about you or talk about me or talk about the church, or maybe young children, when somebody says a lie about you and you know it's not true and it hurts you and you want to strike back at them or wail on them or do something bad to them to teach them a lesson. That's just distractions. That's all it is. You're doing a great work. What Sanballat says is, we're going to send this letter out, and it's going to accuse you of 2 things. One is you want to be king, and the other is you want your people to overthrow our king. And we're going to send it out in a letter, but you'll notice in the text it says an unsealed letter. Now, when you get something in the mail, or if somebody hands you an envelope and it's not sealed, but it's just stuffed inside, or maybe it's just open, what is the temptation that you have? Well, it's unsealed. So that must mean I can read it. And so I have never done this because I am perfect and don't do these kinds of things. But there have been times where I have kind of opened it up and looked inside and just peeked a little bit because it was unsealed. Can you imagine the damage this would do to Nehemiah if it passed from person to person to person to person and it was an unsealed letter? And somebody would read it and says, well, Nehemiah wants to be the king. They're planning a revolt. Hands it off to somebody else and say, Nehemiah, I thought Nehemiah was doing this for God, not for himself. But here it says he wants to be the king. And they begin to read only part of the letter, and they only get pieces of it. And all of a sudden, you've got all this innuendo, all these rumors and gossips going on. It causes great discredit to the work of Nehemiah. And if you look at verse 8, it says there, I sent him this reply, nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head. You know, when somebody lies about you, you've got one or two choices. You can just ignore it, and sometimes that's the best course, just to ignore it. But there are times when somebody says something about you and they're trying to discredit you that you've got to call them out on it. You got to call them out on it. You've got to say, what you are saying is not true. I've had that happen to me a few times and through some difficult times, decisions and stuff like that, where people would say, you did this because of this. And I can remember being in elders meetings where people would come in and they would say, this is what you did. I know this is what you did. And I would have to, most of the time, just sit there and take it. But every once in a while, I'd get to the point where I would say, I'm not going to take it anymore. And I would look at that individual and I would say, you are not right. This is not true. I am telling you, you don't know my motives. You don't know my heart on this. This is not right. And sometimes that has to happen. And it can lead to just difficult discussions. It can lead to difficulties with relationships. But the reality is that Nehemiah thought it was important enough there that he say, nothing like this, what you are saying is happening. You are just trying to make it up out of your head. He called him out on it. And then it says in verse 9, then they were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. When you're the victim of innuendo and lies and gossip, you have to decide with the discernment that only God can give you whether it's time for you to stand up and publicly say, this is wrong, or whether you just let it go and move on. And I think you do that through counseling, through friendships, through relationships with other people, making sure that you take the right steps. Now, there's a third thing here. And this is kind of interesting to me. It's not innuendo this time. Rather, it is the idea that he is going to distract him by sin. And I think what I said in my notes is that it was intimidation. It's a word that shows up in the text. He says in verse 10, one day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delilah, the son of Medibal, who was shut in at his home. And he said, let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you. But I said, should a man like me run away? Or should someone like me go into the temple and save his life? I will not go. I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and they would give me a bad name to discredit me. They started out with trying to invite Nehemiah to go down to the resort city on the Mediterranean called Ono. And that invitation was rebuffed by Nehemiah 4 times. Then they tried to rumor and gossip the problem to make it greater so that maybe he would be discredited in that way. But Nehemiah called him out and just said, no, I'm not. What you're making up is coming out of your own head. It's not true. And so then they went out and they hired a friend of Nehemiah's to invite him to do something that on the surface looks like it would not be a bad thing to do. What they wanted to do is they wanted to discredit Nehemiah by tricking him into sin. What was the sin? The sin was, as Shemaiah says, let us go into the house of God, and implied in that is to go as far and as deep as we can into the house of God, which would mean the Holy of Holies, and we'll hide out there because they're coming to kill you. And for any man of God, that guy might say, well, that makes sense. They're not going to be able to get me now, and we'll be able to finish the wall and all of that, except for it was a sin for anybody other than the high holy priest to go into the Holy of Holies. It was absolutely a sin, and Nehemiah knew it. And so he knew that this was an effort to try to discredit him by committing a sin. And that nearly would have ruined him for sure in his leadership at the very end. Here he was, almost all the way at the finish line, and here he was going to be discredited by committing a sin that would be obvious to everybody. You can't go into the Holy of Holies. You're not the high priest. And so Nehemiah says in verse 14, remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they have done. And remember the prophet Noadiah and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. When you're trying to do great things, people try to intimidate you. They try to give you reasons to cut corners. They try to give you reasons to shave the edges maybe a little bit. They try to say, you don't have to be quite as serious about this as you are. And yet here's Nehemiah saying, I am dead serious about this. And I am not going to sin and discredit my work, the great work that I'm doing, by sinning in that way. And then the text goes on in verse 14. And Nehemiah shows here a lot of truth when he says, remember also the prophet Noadiah and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. Listen, one thing Nehemiah had may have been a spiritual gift of his. But if it wasn't, it was still part of his makeup. He had a great sense of discernment. Do you know people who are wired in such a way that when they see something, they see it for exactly what it is, and they are not fooled easily? We all know people like that. We think, man, that got right by me, and I didn't even know that was what was going on. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10 tells us that as part of the special gifts that God gives his believers, that there is this spirit of discernment that is placed in us through the Holy Spirit. And some people have that gift and they use it, and we depend greatly upon it. We look for people with discernment. But I want you to know, even if you don't have that special gift, you have this book. And this book is the greatest source of discernment outside of the Holy Spirit of God that has ever existed on the earth. And when you're making decisions and when you're being called to do things, you should make sure, we just talked about this in Sunday school this morning, you should make sure that it lines up with this book. This book is the truth. And if it goes against what this book says, then you shouldn't do it at all. For Nehemiah, it was pretty simple. I do not belong in the Holy of Holies. So I know that whatever they're trying to do with me, that is a trick and that is a sin and that is a cause for them to discredit me. Now listen, you may have a boss who leans into you every once in a while and wants you to cut corners. Or maybe you got a family member who doesn't want you to be quite so serious about your faith than you are. And you may have this kind of weird feeling in the back of your head where you're saying, you know what, that just isn't right. And you go back to the Word and you see that it's not right. And you stand up for what's true. If you're going to be a bold leader, if you're going to execute the visions that come out of burdens and develop into plans, you're going to have a sense of discernment. And there are times when I just come up against a decision, and there are times I just kind of step back because I'm just not sure. Maybe I've got people that I call and say, what does this look like to you? This doesn't feel right to me. This doesn't line up with how I think God's leading me. And a lot of times those people, good friends of mine, will say, well, what's the Word say? I say, what's the Word say? The Word says don't do it. So don't do it. Invitation, innuendo, intimidation. The three last-ditch efforts of Satan to derail Nehemiah, the great leader. The one who was the bold leader. The one who would say, listen, I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. And guess what? It didn't work at all. Matter of fact, the Bible gives us this little epilogue here at the end. It says in verse 15, so the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. 52 days. That's amazing, isn't it? All that manual labor in just 52 days? And when all our enemies had heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. See, when you do things for God, when you execute a burden that becomes a vision, that becomes a plan, there are people that are watching you. And when you complete that work, when you cross the finish line, whether you're a teacher, a parent, a business leader, a teenager, a church leader, whatever it is, when you cross the finish line, there are going to be people sitting in the back going, wow. Obviously, in order for that to happen, God was in the middle of that. And that's what happens. So, I want to challenge you as we end this summer series and start back into our fall, that you live boldly for Him. And that you allow God to speak to your heart about a burden maybe you have on your heart. And allow Him to develop that into a vision. And develop that into a plan. And whatever it is you do as you turn the corner out of summer 2018, I want you to know whatever it is that you're doing, it is a great work. And you should not come down. But stay the course and press on and run the race through the finish line. Would you stand for me, please?